Now, I have spoken about knowledge about politics in the previous session, which is essential, and that is the knowledge about politics, and that is extremely essential in understanding the actual text. Now, in any country, you need to know the three authorities in any country. As a translator, if you don't understand the position and the power of each authority in any country, then you won't be able to translate things or words properly. For example, the Secretary of State in the US is the foreign minister in another country. So the Secretary of State, Wazir Kharjiya, is the foreign minister in another country. And of course, the foreign secretary in Britain. So the foreign secretary in Britain is the same as the foreign minister in terms of position in another country, and it's the same as Secretary of State in another country. For example, talking about terminology, the Pentagon you need to know that the Pentagon is Wazarat al-Difa, the Defense Ministry in the US. So when they mention the Pentagon, they don't mean just a pentagon or a shape which is in the shape of a pentagon. It's a building, and that building implies that it is now the one used for defense. Now there is another, let's say the White House also means the President's office in the US. In another country, it will be, instead of the White House as being the administrative authority in that country, it could be 10 Downing Street or any other where the prime ministers reside. Now, let's look at these authorities first and know what they are doing and what is the structure of them, so that we understand the actual knowledge about politics and how it works in any country. The first authority or power out of the three powers or authorities is legislative. And legislative means we are talking about the body or the entity which runs which actually passes laws or legislations, and that is the Parliament. And the Parliament is really different from one country to another, but the members of the Parliament are those who are voted by the people of that country. And the Parliament can be called different names. Like, for example, in Russia, the Parliament is called Duma. And then Westminster is in UK, for example. Majlis al-Ummah is in Kuwait, Nations Council or National Council. Consultatory Council is Majlis al-Shura in KSA, for instance. So in each country, there is a parliament, and sometimes it's the House of Commons, let's say, which is Majlis al-Umum in UK. This is where the Parliament is. So they can say the House of Commons, and they can say the Westminster. But in the Parliament or in the Westminster, there are two houses, House of Commons and House of Lords. In another country, it will be House of Representatives and the Senate. In other words, senators. So in the House of Lords, these are people or senators are different from House of Representatives, members in the House of Representatives. So the Parliament is representing the whole country administratively, and it is headed by the head of the Parliament. However, for example, in Britain, it's the Speaker who is the one who is actually leading the Parliament in terms of letting somebody speak and announcing as a spokesperson of the House. So that's the parliament. Sometimes they call it Parlement in Arabic, or Majlis al-Sha'b, the People's Council. So that is the first authority from which there will be the presidents that will be elected. So what happens is that who elects these, the presidents, of course, it's the time of the elections and where they are set and so on, they are from the parliament. Then we move on to the second authority in any country, and this executive authority or power is what's called the government. And the government is different from the state. So a state is the head of the state, is the head of the whole country. Now sometimes in some countries the head of the state or the whole of the country can be a president, can be a queen, can be a king. So it is really important for the translator to be aware of the executive authorities or the government, which is different from one country to another. And the government, unlike the state, usually consists of only ministers, Minister of Health, Minister for Education, and so on. And they have departments, for example, Department for Education. And that means it's not an actual small department, it is a ministry. Then the National Health Service is another ministry, Ministry of Health, Department of Health, for health. So these are different government entities that the translator needs to be aware of in order to be able to know how to translate, because he needs to know, or she needs to know, who is speaking in authority in a report, in a media report, in a press report. Could be a minister or could be a member from the parliament. A minister is the executive authority. In other words, they actually execute any orders that are being given or passed by the legislative powers, the parliament. So sometimes some of these, like a white paper being passed by the legislative authority, which is the one that will pass any legislation, this is for the parliament. Now, when it comes to the executive authority, the executive authority, like there are ministers and the prime minister. And this authority, the prime minister, is the government and the ministers. These are called the cabinet. And of course, the word cabinet in English with a C capital, it doesn't mean it's the chest of drawers where you can use your stuff or put some ornaments in. The cabinet is the ministers themselves, with their prime minister as head of them. And he or she will be the head of the government. And in this case, of course, like for example, the Vice Chancellor of Germany, for example, he's the head of the government, but he's not the head of the state. He's not the president of the country. He is the head of the state, but he's not the president of the government of the country. So there is a president of Germany, but there is also the vice chancellor, who is the one who deals with foreign affairs outside the country and in that particular country. But it can vary from one country to another, who is the highest authority in that country as a head of state. So the head of government is different from a head of state. Sometimes the head of state and the head of government are the same. Depends on which country. And this kind of information is extremely important for the translator of political translation, of political text into their own mother tongue or into another language. The third authority, which is extremely important as well, and it is also separate from the executive and separate from legislative, and each one is separate from the other. The judicial authority or power is in the law and the courts, lawyers and judges. So this authority, which is to do with the courts, is completely separate to the executive authority, which is the ministers. And it's completely separate to the legislative authority, which are the parliamentarians who represent their own constituency or their own people. If we don't understand that, for example, if there is a judgment or a sentence being given by a court, who is to execute or implement that particular sentence, it is actually under the government. It will be Ministry of Interior Affairs, the Home Office. So it depends on the Ministry of Interior. So in actual fact, decisions made by the judges in the judicial authority as part of it will be implemented by the executive authorities, i.e. the government, which is, and usually it is related to, for example, if the sentence is related to health, then the Ministry of Health. If it's related to security, then it is the police and the Interior Ministry, who will implement the court's decisions. But of course, also, the courts are, I have to actually emphasize, and you need to know as a translator, that when you are translating, for example, an event or a report where a judge decides on something and then a minister states something else, and then you have a parliamentarian who's saying something else, you need to know which one is representing which authority. So it is extremely important to know these things, these powers in a country. You need to understand also these powers in that particular country that you're translating from. So that, and sometimes you might have to say, this person, if you are translating into target language, if you want to explain the Secretary of State, for example, in US, you need to say, although it says Secretary of State, it's actually the Foreign Minister in our country. So you need to show that you understand in the target culture, in the target language, what the equivalent of that particular title or position of the person who is speaking. Now, who will be in authority to investigate or expose these powers? It is actually, you need to be aware of, it is the media. So the media power, it's not an authority as such, but it's called in English the fourth estate. And in Arabic it's called the fourth authority, figuratively speaking. It has no authority as such, as a form of the country, but it has the authority of exposing the judicial authority or the executive authority or the legislative authority. In other words, you need to be aware when you are translating, let's say, a media report or an opinion in the newspaper or on TV, on a radio or an official website, you need to be aware that the media does not have that power of implementing any of the judicial authority over judicial authority or executive authority or legislative authority. It's just only to report on these three authorities, the first three. And that's where the media comes in. Now let's take an example of an event. Then what happens is that in that event, in the report, let's say it's an interview or it's a speech, If it's a speech, the media will make it into a report, which is 3-minute report, let's say, taking only parts of the speech and reorganizing them, reordering them. Also, it could be an interview, also taking only quotations from that interview. Now, if it's a report, usually they say what, where, when, and who. For example, let's give an example about a car accident. So the 4 questions are: what happened, where it happened, where this accident happened, who was involved in the accident, and when was the accident. This kind of information in the report will be basic information describing what's happening. However, in the report, usually when you are translating the report, there will be not only what, where, when, and who information, but there will be also why this is happening or how it can be solved. But what happens is that the reporter goes and quotes some people in that accident, car accident. Perhaps they can interview or have a quotation by somebody from the ambulance service, which is the health, which is the executive part. And then somebody from also another department, which is like the police warden or traffic police, as to what happened in the accident. And this is also related to another part in the government, which is executive, which is the Ministry of Interior. So that is another quotation which you need to be aware of as a translator. Otherwise, you are not in a position to translate if you don't know what is the significance of this person who's speaking in the report. So you have somebody from the ambulance service, somebody for police, a traffic warden, transportation, and perhaps you can, in the ambulance service, how many people died, what was the accident like, and so on. And then also you have somebody who is independent, like a pedestrian, a witness who has seen the accident, like or members of the victims of the accident being interviewed. So these are the players in a news story, a news item, which you need to be aware of, these players in this story and their significance, their importance, their positions, and what are they trying to say. In order to help you produce this report in an objective way. Of course, another way, there is another element, which is what's called the NGOs, which is the non-government organizations, who are like, for example, Greenpeace, who don't have the power. They are associations or entities who do not have the power in the country, but they do actually try to be, it's a civil authority or entity or organization. So it's important to know that if they are NGOs, they are not in the government. In other words, they don't have that executive authority that ministers would have. So this is how you understand these powers, and this is extremely, extremely important. In the next episode, I'm going to explain to you, give you an example where about one of these, about a sample in translation, in political translation. I will translate it into Arabic to show you how it works and how you analyze it.